Hello, everybody. Today we're talking about the election of 1824, sometimes referred to as the corrupt bargain election. Our objective question today is, was the election of 1824 a corrupt bargain? Why or why not? Now, a few things to get into first. First, let's just look at a hypothetical situation. We have President A, B, C, and D. And right here to the right, we have the previously held office. We see that President A used to be vice president, President B used to be Secretary of State, President C was Secretary of State, and President D was Secretary of State. So what pattern or trends emerges? Well, we can clearly see that it appears that Secretary of State is a natural stepping stone in order to becoming president. All right, so keep that in mind. Also, let's just assume that if we had four candidates, these would be the qualifications to become president. One is a talented Secretary of State. One is the Speaker of the House of Representatives, one is the Treasurer, and one is a military hero. Now, some of you may think that some of these are more qualified to be president. That's fine. I would love to hear your thoughts on this. We just, don't have time. I would love to hear who you think is least qualified just based on this. But anyway, keep all that in the back of your mind. And then lastly, some results. So just take a minute to look at that, and we'll come back to those numbers in a little bit. Now, secondly, before we can understand if this election was a corrupt bargain, we should understand what a corrupt bargain is. So if something is corrupt, it shows that there's some dishonesty going on, there's some sketchiness, okay? So corrupt is, bad, evil, right? What is a bargain? A bargain is some kind of deal. Another word, a synonym you could use to explain bargain is a compromise, all right? So a sketchy compromise. So was the election of 1824 a sketchy compromise? Let's find out. So, election of 1824, James Monroe is finishing up his second term, very popular, completed the Monroe Doctrine, the era of good feelings, right? There are 3 requirements to vote in the country at this point. You have to be white, you have to be a wealthy landowner, well, you have to be a landowner, and you have to be male, all right? Cool. Now, the issue with this election is that the Federalists have pretty much died out, which means there's only one political party, and they're all Democratic Republicans, which means that every single person running for president is a Democratic Republican. And since, for the most part, there's obviously slight differences, but for the most part, all the Democratic Republicans have the same kind of ideals, this election's not going to be based on what they politically believe, for the most part, right? Because if every single person running is of the exact same political party, they're very, very similar. And instead of basing your vote on their, political ideals, instead, this election is going to be based on personality, how much you can relate to them, and of course, the region that they support. Because remember, sectionalism is very high and popular at this point. So if I'm from the South and there's a Southerner running, I'll probably throw my weight behind him. Because for the most part, all of their political ideas are the same. I just want the South to be represented in the highest office, all right? And same goes for the North, same goes for the West. So for a variety of reasons, mostly being that all the people have the exact same ideas, this is going to be basically a popularity and region contest. Now, there are 4 candidates, 4 Democratic Republicans that run for president in 1824. We'll talk about each one of these. Andrew Jackson, William Crawford, John Quincy Adams, and Henry Clay. Let's talk about each one of those. William Crawford was from Georgia, so he's from the South. He is pro-slavery. He's the Secretary of the Treasury at this point. So he's also a member of Congress, all right? So, pretty wealthy dude, has the support of the South. John Quincy Adams, he's from Massachusetts, which means he's from the North, right? He is also the son of the president. He's son of the second president, John Adams, and he's the current Secretary of State. He's a very, very popular, powerful, and effective Secretary of State. Since he's from Massachusetts and that northern east region of our country where a lot of manufacturing and stuff is done, he's going to favor the wealthy. Okay? Next, Andrew Jackson. Look at him. Andrew Jackson from Tennessee. He's a war hero. He fought in the War of 1812. He despises the British. He's middle class, your average Joe. Remember the Battle of New Orleans where he defeated the British even after the war was over, but we kind of fudged the numbers on that. We were so happy to have a great victory. He's referred to as the people's president. He's relatable, and that's the most important aspect of Andrew Jackson, is that people, not in the South, or well, a little bit in the South, but mostly in the West, because he's from Tennessee, right, feel like they can relate to him. He feels like an average Joe. He feels like one of the people, and it would be so amazing for these, Southerners and Westerners to have someone they can truly identify with in the highest position. And then, of course, our man Henry Clay. What would an entire lesson be without Henry Clay showing up at some point? Here he is. He's running for the presidency. So remember that he created the Missouri Compromise, the Compromise of 1820, that allowed Missouri and Maine to enter in, that temporarily saved us from the Civil War. At this point, he's the Speaker of the House of Representatives, so a very powerful position. And remember that he's the Hamilton of this unit, and that is just to say he's involved in absolutely everything. All right? Cool. So back to our hypothetical, where we were looking at the previous things, right? This is obviously a trend that we've seen in U.S. history. Obviously discounting George Washington because there was nothing before him. John Adams was the vice president before becoming president, but everyone else we've looked at so far has been the Secretary of State before becoming president. Also, the table that showed us qualifications, the Secretary of State, the Speaker of the House, the Treasury, and the war hero. These directly relates to the candidates of this time. So if back in the beginning you thought a war hero wasn't really qualified, you'd probably wouldn't vote for Andrew Jackson. If you thought a powerful Secretary of State was probably the best pick, then you would be behind John Quincy Adams. Now, the numbers I showed you absolutely were not hypothetical. These were real. So which candidate received the most popular votes? Well, if I'm looking at the popular votes column and I look down here, candidate D got the most. Okay, which candidate received the most electoral votes? Candidate D. All right, so which candidate became the president of the United States? If I'm looking just at this, I would assume it was Andrew Jackson. Here are the voting results. Green, Andrew Jackson, 43% of the popular vote, 38% of the electoral vote. Looks to me like he probably won. But he didn't. In fact, no one wins the first round of the election of 1824. Why is that? Because the 12th Amendment says that a candidate has to receive the majority of electoral votes. Now, I know what you're going to say. Miss Rogers, he did. He got 43. He got more than everybody else. But what I need to remind you is that there's a difference between getting the most votes and getting the majority of the votes. In order to get the majority of the votes, you need to get more than 51%. You need to get more than everybody else combined. And that's, of course, going to be difficult when there are 4 people running. It's much easier to do when there's only 2. So, according to the 12th Amendment, when no one gets the majority, the House of Representatives ends up picking the winner. Now, only the top 3 candidates are going to be moved from this stage of the election to the House of Representatives. So the person with the 4th least amount of votes is kind of basically just disqualified, and that is, of course, Henry Clay. So how will we decide who the president is? The House of Representatives gets to choose. Well, remind us who's the speaker or leader of that group? Henry Clay. So basically, Henry Clay is now the leader of the group that gets to pick the president, and he is now disqualified. So it's left to John Quincy Adams, Andrew Jackson, and William Crawford. Here's a great political cartoon. Shows Andrew Jackson, John Quincy Adams, and Crawford setting off on the race, and Henry Clay is left in the dust because he has been eliminated. All right, so what ends up happening? Clay's disqualified from running because he got the least amount of votes. Crawford suffers a stroke, and he'll later recover, but at this point he's basically seen as, a vegetable that can't really produce much, so he's basically eliminated as well. And now the election comes down in the House between John Quincy Adams and Andrew Jackson. So what ends up actually happening? Henry Clay has a lot of power in the House, and he dislikes both of these individuals. He used to be friends with John Quincy Adams. They had a falling out, especially when Monroe picked John Quincy Adams over Henry Clay for Secretary of State. He also really hates Jackson. He thinks Jackson's a complete crazy person, and he's not 100% wrong, but he dislikes both of these individuals. But when it comes to political views, he more closely leans towards John Quincy Adams. And then, after a really long romantic dinner over candlelight and some wine and some meat, right, Henry Clay decides to support John Quincy Adams. Right? And he uses his power to get Adams elected. Here's a great newspaper clipping here. Clay chooses Adams. Just minutes before the House of Representatives was set to cast their votes to determine the next president of the United States, House Speaker Henry Clay took the stand and gave a strong recommendation that the representatives choose former Secretary of State John Quincy Adams. And when the House of Representatives ended up voting, hurrah, John Quincy Adams gets 54, which is a majority. It's more than both of the other two together, and John Quincy Adams wins. Now, that in itself isn't wrong. Henry Clay got to decide who he wanted to support, and then he picked the person who was best for him. That in itself isn't wrong. But what people started getting really, really concerned about, and the reason a lot of people, especially Jackson and his supporters, believe that this is a corrupt bargain, is because immediately after being elected, John Quincy Adams makes Henry Clay his Secretary of State. Remember that position that's really important? Remember that position that Clay has wanted for the last couple presidencies? Remember the thing that Clay wants to do so he can become president? John Quincy Adams gave that position to Henry Clay. And a lot of people believe that there was a sketchy deal that was made, that John Quincy Adams said, hey, if you get me elected, I'll make you Secretary of State and you'll be the next president. Now, is there definitive proof? There are some sources you can look into. We don't have time to do that, but there are definitely some interesting sources about that meeting that they had, that long romantic dinner they had. But, it's up to speculation here. So the effects of the election, one, it's going to curse John Quincy Adams' presidency. He's going to be a very unpopular president from the start because a lot of people don't like the way he became president. It's also going to form a new political party that we still see elements of today, and that's the Democratic Party. Andrew Jackson takes his followers, his Democratic Republicans, and they break away and they form the Democratic Party. More details on them later. It's going to restore the two-party political system. It's going to do away with only Democratic Republicans. This is going to make winning the majority easier later on. This is also the second time a president's been chosen by Congress. It's only ever happened before in the year 1800 when Alexander Hamilton got Thomas Jefferson elected over Aaron Burr. And this is also the first time a president is going to win the office without winning the popular vote. This has only happened 5 times in U.S. history. And those presidents were, of course, John Quincy Adams, we just talked about, Hayes, Harrison, Bush Jr., and Trump. And then, of course, a very, very sassy, feisty, mean campaign between John Quincy Adams running for re-election and Andrew Jackson running as a Democrat is going to take place in 1828. All right, so that was the corrupt bargain. I want you to decide for yourself whether or not it was corrupt. It is an opinion, but you got to justify your reasoning. All right, that's it. Have a great day.